And as a reminder, our next meeting is going to be Thursday, September 12th, and that'll be in person at Friendship Auditorium. And I am here to introduce our two speakers tonight. We've got Dr. Adrienne Edwards and Rachel Schleiger, who just wrote a wonderful book on firescaping. They're both plant ecologists up at Chico State and also at Cal State. Oh yeah, the Butte College. I think you guys are both working at both places. No, one of you is working at both places. It's a lot of work. And I just want to remind people we will have a question and answer period after their presentation. And we also have a chance for you to win a copy of their book, which we will purchase online from your book publisher and mail to you. So hang in after the lecture, and we'll try to do choose somebody at random. So without further ado, thank you so much for being here. I'm very excited to hear what you have to say, especially what's going on with our wildfire season right now. So I will let you two take it away, and I will be quiet. Thank you again.
All right. Well, Rachel, thank you. Thank you so much for having us. And Rachel is setting up the slideshow, and I will be presenting in the first half, and she will present in the second half. And Rachel, of course, you can always interject if you think something needs to be added.
No
and
problem.
We have, yeah, and we even have some extra slides at the end to entertain questions with. But Rachel and I actually share an office at Chico State, and we were talking after the campfire, which was in our backyards, and went through actually Rachel's backyard, and I was about a half a mile away from a backburn. But the thing that occurred to us is we weren't seeing anything that was marrying the idea of defensible space with creating habitat, because okay. And of course it's critical to support habitat. Otherwise we're moving into beautiful places and then punching holes in the habitat and affecting the biodiversity there. So if you can move to the next slide, Rachel. And so this is just a rough outline of, the outline of what we're going to talk about. I'm going to briefly introduce defensible space, which hopefully everyone is aware of, but just so that we're all on the same playing field, so to speak. Then there are so many details to firescaping and creating habitat that we could talk about, but there's not enough time in the week, right? So I'm going to focus on 3 psychological conventions, is what I'm calling it, related to defensible space that affects our habitats that we create. Fencing, foundation plantings versus habitat islands, and mulching. And then Rachel will take over the mic and is going to present a case study for us and offer some tools that folks can use to really analyze where you live and sort of have greater security in understanding what fire behavior may do in where you live. Okay, good. So here's the basic idea of defensible space. I'm also assuming as hardcore gardeners and landscapers that you are aware of the term wildland urban interface, or the WUI, as we like to refer to it. And the WUI is where you've got people living interdigitated or next to wildland habitats. And that's where we see the greatest structure damage and structure losses during out of control fires. So that's the highest fire risk zone. But again, it's when we move to these beautiful places to be nearer to nature, it's also the place where we're causing the greatest habitat fragmentation. And multiple studies have made it clear that habitat fragmentation is the #1 cause of biodiversity loss globally. And so if you look at this graphic in the bottom left-hand corner, I just put a little protractor to illustrate the differences in the steepness of slopes. And so if you have a shallower slope, of course, you can handle vegetation that's a little bit closer together. As the slope increases, you've got to have a little bit greater distance between combustible fuels, right? Because fire actually preheats the fuels when it goes uphill. And that's why you need that. On the other hand, if you clear those slopes completely, not only do you lose the ability to slow the winds and reduce turbulence, but you also lose slope stability. And there's actually a lovely research paper that looked at how different species of shrubs root on slopes. And some of them actually have roots that tend to grow upwards, upslope. Some intentionally grow downslope, and some go straight down. And in terms of architectural stability of those slopes, planting species that have those different characteristics in different spots in the slope can actually strengthen the slope that much more. It's kind of like thinking about which way you send the rebar to strengthen concrete. And so focusing in on our little blue house here, you can see that there's really just 3 major zones you have to keep in mind. The non-combustible zone is where you don't want anything that can burn during fire season. The lean, clean, and green zone has to be thinned. You need discontinuous fuels, but you can do a lot in that space to provide habitat. And then the wildland fuel reduction, you may do some cleaning, but if you are lucky enough to live in a place where you've got that much space, it's important to allow snags and some, you can do some cleaning to make fuels a little less continuous, but it's also important to leave habitat. And that's a lot of information jam-packed into this slide, but just there it is, defensible space, keeping in mind also creating habitat space. Okay, next slide. All right, so now I'm going to talk about the 3 psychological conventions. The first one is fences. We love to draw fences around our homesteads. When I was a kid, on rainy days at my grandmother's house, I would play with Lincoln logs, and the Lincoln logs, of course, had little shrubberies that you could put around things and little fences you could put around things. And those conventions were very much instilled in me, even as a kid, that you put the shrubberies and the trees right up next to buildings, and you put the fences to enclose your structures, right? So Robert Frost said, fences make good neighbors. But if you dig into his poem, he asks the question, why do they make good neighbors? Isn't it where there are cows? But if you don't have cows and all you have is plants, then why do you really need it? So he says, what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give it a fence, is the question about why we build fences and walls. Okay, next slide. So I would say that even as you're considering your landscape options and designs, you should evaluate where and what kind of fencing you feel that you need. Fences influence how we experience our surroundings. If you build a really tall fence, you're not going to be able to see the birds as well in the neighbor's trees, maybe. Fences manage our social boundaries, our psychological boundaries, our personal boundaries, and they also kind of interpret our social relationships. And, you know, I don't know if this is true. I haven't seen the data on it, but I think that we build a lot more privacy fences than we used to when I was a kid. And then, of course, fences, again, can also just become reflex that you assume and have instilled in your psyche that you need to enclose your homestead without consideration to how they might affect us or the wildlife around us. Okay, next slide. So here's a beautiful picture of how you might want to reevaluate the use of fencing. I've pointed out a lot of problems with the fencing in this case. You can see wood fencing right up against houses, which is like a railroad train that goes right to a house that's just fuel and can connect house structures in during a wildfire emergency. There's also cases where if you have wood fences then overlapped with vegetation, that can be problematic. And even the wood fences that are then fenced in themselves by chain link fence that has those privacy vinyl slats, which are also flammable. Next slide. To put this into the perspective of defensive space, I made this simple sort of heuristic graph. On the x-axis is how much privacy you have, and on the y-axis is fire risk. In the non-combustible zone, I have represented open metal fencing, chain link fencing, ornate metal fencing, and rock walls. Those are the only things that should be in the non-combustible zone. Fire risk increases with wood fencing. You can increase privacy again with by having denser fencing, by having privacy slats. People have been getting more creative here in Butte County, where we've seen so many devastating fires recently. We've seen a lot more use of things like corrugated metal blended with widely spaced wood posts and that sort of thing, which can significantly reduce fire risk, but still give you the privacy that you may crave. And then vinyl fencing is actually, well, I'm not crazy about vinyl fencing, as I'll just say, but vinyl fencing actually requires a higher ignition temperature than wood. But once it ignites, it melts, it turns into this molten lava that can continue producing heat and igniting things. So it's not fireproof. Natural hedges are excellent, excellent habitat, but they have to be maintained. And as you can see here, once you lose that lean, clean, green hedge work, then you can end up with actually having fire traps. And one of the problems with repeatedly hedging shrubs is that you get this outer frosting of green leaves with lots and lots of fine fuels on the inside. So once the embers penetrate that, then you've got a real bonfire. Okay, next slide. So just to summarize, in the non-combustible zone, you've got to have non-combustible fencing. A lot of the people rebuilding in Paradise, for example, in that non-combustible zone, they have metal fencing, and then they may have privacy wood fencing beyond that. In the lean, clean, and green zone, you really, I think it's worth, asking yourself, what is the balance of privacy and security that I really want here, and how can I do that with minimal fire risk? Because we know that dry wood in particular is a really significant source of burning embers in a fire situation. You can also consider breaking up horizontal fuels in your fencing, as well as in your landscaping. So, and of course, being huge advocates for wildlife and wild plants, rock walls and living fences create amazing habitat. Hedgerows, bird habitat, rock walls will be filled with all sorts of critters. And the key is you just have to manage them during fire season to keep them clean. All right, next slide. And this is a cool thing that maybe some of you have seen down there. It's fairly new to me. It's one way that you can reduce the ignitability of fencing. And it's yakasugi. And it actually, if you char the wood before you install it or after you've installed it under safe conditions, it actually makes the wood more fire resistant, more water resistant, and more resistant to rot. And the reason for that is that the charring actually burns off the celluloses that make up the cell walls that built the wood, but it leaves behind the lignins. So these are just the molecules that make up the cell walls that make up the wood, and they differ in their ignition temperature. And that's why the lignins stay behind. It requires more to light them. That doesn't mean they won't burn, and they will burn hot once you ignite them, but they're a little more resistant, and they don't throw off as much embers in a fire situation. So the other thing that's worth considering is if you build fencing with boards that have high tannin content and also char that wood, that can reduce flammability as well, because tannins, interestingly enough, the stuff that we use to tan leather and makes acorns bitter, actually form fire-resistant graphene, which is something that's even used in electronics to have resistance against fire. So it's just kind of cool stuff to think about in design. Next slide. Okay, so enough about fencing. Psychological convention number 2, foundation plantings. That's me as a kid putting all those little wooden plants up against my house that I built with my Lincoln logs, right? So we like to plant right next to our homes. Foundation plantings most usually add fuel to the fire, or they can hold flames next to your building. So even if they don't ignite right away, they can smolder there until they take or actually light your house. So there are rare cases where they may not, or ways that you can manage an existing situation to reduce that fire risk as well. I found this quote from a lovely poem. It is foolish to let a young redwood grow next to a house. But her reference there was because it makes you think about longer term things other than just the dirty pots and pans in your sink. All right, next slide. Rachel and I took a walk in the campfire footprint in Paradise just a few weeks ago, looking at some of the new homes that have been rebuilt. And this was incredibly depressing to me. It's got a beautiful fence, really sound, fire resistant architectural design. It's got good trees set back from the house. However, it's like The yard was underlain with landscape fabric, 2 color tones of gravel, a patch of lawn, and then all these plants pushed up next to the house. So it's kind of backwards thinking from the message that we're trying to get out about defensible space and habitat. Next slide. So foundation plantings are beautiful. As I said, they can capture embers and hold them next to the house. There are exceptions where maybe on the leeward side of the house, a really lush, well-maintained, well-loved plant that's isolated might be okay. I would imagine that an insurance adjuster would not agree because they wouldn't understand. But there are instances where you see trees and shrubs that in fire scars where the building burned, but the plants are still there. It's and the reason that happens in part is because you have to understand wind, and Rachel's going to talk about that in the second half of the talk. And so, next slide. Bottom line is there really should not be any fuels within the first 5 feet of a structure. And if you're in a high fire zone, like Rachel, it really needs to be at least 15 feet. And for a gardener, you might see this and think, oh, that's devastating. But there are ways that you can work with this. Again, thinking in terms of looking out the window to habitat islands, to see the wildlife, to see the flowers. You can't see the stuff right next to your house anyway when you're inside. And the other consideration is that you could do seasonal plantings that then can be like annuals that once they die off, you can rake them away. Next slide. So rather than having foundation plantings, we really, really need to get away from that idea of tucking things under the eaves of our homes and creating habitat islands. And the reason I use the word island is because I'm trying to reinforce the idea that you need to have discontinuous fuels that are broken up by non-combustible zones. And those habitat island plantings can capture embers, maybe slow the winds, and reduce the ember rain on your house. Next slide. Oh, wait, go back. And this bottom slide with the gnome and the man standing out, this is a beautiful case of very large trees that if they're properly maintained and cleaned up, and limbed up significantly, could actually protect the house more than being a problem. Okay, next slide. And this is just an example of habitat islands with broken up non-combustible zones. In this case, it's decomposed granite. But there are many ways you could create this sort of function. This is just something I pulled off online. Thanks. Next slide. Third psychological convention, mulches. We're fixated on covering our yards with mulches, and especially here in California where we have to worry about water. When are mulches good? This is a question we need to ask ourselves. And when do they simply break down the connection between above ground and below ground? There's a whole ecosystem below our feet. Heaven is under our feet as well as over our heads. Next slide. So here's another example from the campfire footprint, a newly rebuilt home with up and coming landscaping. Again, they did a good job of setting the new trees away from the house, but then they have other combustibles right adjacent to the house. And then I'm hoping that over time, they will be able to create habitat islands around this area. And you can see, just looking at the fencing, they've got wood fencing except for that non-combustible zone. Okay, next slide. And just to reinforce this, you should never have combustibles, actually organic mulches, shredded rubber mulches, landscape fabrics, or astroturf, God forbid, next to a structure. And this demonstration really brings that home, that if you have those combustibles right up next to a building, they smolder until they ignite. And in the next slide, I want to show you a really cool demonstration where if you're going to use organic mulches, if they are composted first, they actually retain more moisture and it changes the composition of that wood, in part removing those celluloses again, leaving more lignin. So the composted wood chips do not burn as well and do not spread as well. So if we look at this graphic, you can see that shredded rubber mulches are the absolute worst in terms of flame heights and temperatures. They burn really hot and they burn really high, which means greater potential for ignition. When you get into regular, I'm not going to talk about all these categories, but when you just have ground up trees from some tree worker truck, those are about twice as likely to have higher flame heights and temperatures than the composted wood chips. So if you're going to use organic mulches, composted is best. Next slide. And I don't know what things are looking like in terms of landscape trends in SoCal. I know that you guys have some gorgeous gardens down there. But I've been noticing a lot more of this kind of thing, where I have this picture that has no habitat and it's just pots and a few yuccas stuck in the ground with different colored mulches underlaid by weed barrier, right? Landscape fabric. This is a disaster. And to me, when I see that, I think this is like an interior designer arranging furniture and drapes. And there's no life there. This is the kind of thing we need to educate people about. It may be pretty more fire resistant, but there are other ways to do that, and lots of ways to do mulches. And I just gave some examples on the right-hand side of all sorts of things that you can do, broken pots and whatnot. Next slide. Bottom line, and I didn't realize this is animated, is that a habitat is not healthy if it does not support insects, if it doesn't support birds, if it doesn't support wildlife. And the keys to keep in mind is really, as a bare minimum, we should all have at least 30% of our landscape in native plants. You could measure that in numbers of species or just area covered. You need those plants to be put in soils that are compatible, in hydrozones that are compatible, that is with watering that makes sense, if it's heavy clays or sandy or what have you. And I can't imagine anything better than going out on a lovely morning and doing proper pruning instead of pushing a loud lawnmower, right? And I would argue too that we need to mix up our mulching. Just having the same kinds of uniform mulches that are sold to us in stores, we should think outside the box, and we need to diversify that mulching so that it supports wildlife. I live in a very small yard, but I have a leaf swale, a designated place where all of the leaves that fall in my yard, or a lot of them, get raked into this swale, and over the season, various invertebrates break that, and microbes break those leaves down until by the time August comes around, they they break down the leaves, and then I get to load on some more. It's good to have dry materials, hollow stems, wood, etc., as long as you can break it up and keep it away from your structures. And of course, you all as hardcore gardeners know that you want diverse phenologies. I know that someone was one of the people presenting plants has flowers 12 months out of the year, and I can say I also do up here in Northern California. You need diverse habitat structure and no pesticides. 70% of our bees nest underground. And I have to tell you, I have some bare ground areas that are just full of little holes that these native bees are using. And it just warms the cockles of my heart. All right, so I will stop at this point and let Rachel take over.
Thank you, Adrienne. I was actually trying to send you little hearts, when you were talking about leaf swells. But I realized because I was sharing the presentation, that button went away. And so then it ended up, anyway, accelerating slides. Anyway, thank you, Adrienne, so much. And now it's my turn. I am essentially going to talk about my experience in firescaping and habitat gardening in combining with my experience in the campfire. So trying to figure out how to put all of these things together and make something that makes sense, essentially. And one of the biggest questions that we get all the time when we do discussions and talks is, how do I really apply this? Or like, I want to see an example. And so Adrienne was like, why don't you just talk about your house? So I was like, oh, that makes sense. So that's what I'm going to do. So first, I am going to talk a little bit into the context of the campfire to kind of really dive into some of the important points that I'm really going to stay on when it comes to my conversations. So to date, the campfire is the deadliest and destructive wildfire in California because of the amount of structures and lives lost. And the reason why this fire was so devastating was because of the winds. The winds are what caused this fire to sneak up on everyone so fast, and what caused it to really take everybody, just by surprise. So winds really drove this fire. And if you look at the statistics of other fires that catch people by surprise, it's because of wind. So because of that, and because wind happens to be a variable that really creates a dangerous fire behavior, that's something I'm going to talk and highlight a lot in my conversation today. Okay, so one of the other things I wanted to highlight about wind was that it not only can move a fire really fast, but it also blows embers. And if you look at the statistics of why structures light on fire, out of all of these three reasons, radiant heat, direct flame contact, embers is number one. Embers is by far the majority of the reasons why structures light on fire. So embers are essentially little tiny pieces of fuel that are on fire and that get blown by the wind to our structures, land on our structures or adjacent to our structures, and then eventually light them on fire. So wind is the number one reason we should be really thinking about our context of where we live and the type of winds we have and how we should take that into consideration when we're designing our landscapes to be fire safe. And to show an example, I'm going to, go over, oh dang, all these little boxes are in my way. Hold on. And show you some pictures from my trail camera in that's on my property. So this picture is just like right before the fire. So you can see it's 11/7. The campfire started 11/8. So I'm just going to skip by some of my beautiful pictures here. So the fire has started. It just hasn't got to my house yet. Lots of animals. Okay, so now this is the first picture where the fire is getting close to our house. And you can see we know it's somewhat close because the embers are being blown towards the house. So embers can get blown a fair distance, but to still be on fire and to be viewable by something like a trail camera, that means that it is something that's fairly close. So you can see here the embers are definitely moving with the wind, but the next picture I really think emphasizes how serious embers are. So you can see the wind is extreme. It is pushing these embers that are on fire really, really fast. And so anything that is a horizontal structure, whether that's a tree, a shrub, or a structure, it's going to hit those and hit those and hit those and hit those until that thing lights on fire, if it is something that's combustible. So I'm not going to go through all my pictures, but I'll show you a couple more so you can see this one. The embers have kind of stopped because the fire is really, really close now. But nonetheless, this picture I think really takes the cake in illustrating my point. Okay, so let me go back now. Start the slideshow again. Okay, so now I've talked about context of the campfire, a little bit about why wind is important to understand. So now I'm going to give you a little bit of context of where my house is situated so I can kind of talk you through my decision making for firescaping, etc. Okay, so Adrienne talked about the WUI already. I am just going to highlight that there's two different types of WUI. So two different types of communities that you can live in the WUI. There is the interface WUI, which means you live in a normal looking environment, like a little community suburban type of situation, but it's adjacent to a wildland area. And so this is the type of WUI that most people don't realize they are in, or that they are in a dangerous situation. Whereas where I live is what people think of when they think of stereotypical dangerous situation, where you have houses that are basically inside a forest or a wild area. So to illustrate my point here, my house is right in here in this little snapshot from Google Earth. And this is before the fire because everything's nice and green and pretty. But essentially, I wanted to give you some of my context because when it comes to you and your gardens and firescaping, you have to not only think of the context of your property and the little ins and outs of the small details of your property, but you also need to think about the general large scale context of your property as well, because that plays into decision making as well. So I am in intermix. I have a house on a ridgeline bowl, which is probably one of the most dangerous types of topographic features to live on when it comes to fire danger, which is why Adrienne said earlier that I have a 15-foot barrier in the non-combustible zone around my entire house. And then I also live in adjacent to mixed coniferous forest, which means I kind of have a mix of oak woodland and coniferous forest. I'm kind of like in a transition zone. So I have lots of oaks and lots of conifers as well. So it's really, really fun, honestly, to be a plant ecologist and to just have all these different plants in my yard. But nonetheless, that's my important context here. So if we zoom in a little bit, we can see that my house kind of blends in with the landscape. The trees kind of surround the house, and at the ground level, we have lots of trees, but you don't really see much else. So I'm going to talk about why, going over a different sub case study that happened right essentially before and during the fire. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what Adrienne kind of hinted at earlier, which is that plants create barriers to wind. So anytime there is a tree or a shrub or a plant, it's going to create turbulence for wind. But if we hear lots of advice, like, CAL FIRE has lots of amazing advice, and we hear them say, make sure you have lots of clearance around your property to be safe for fire. A lot of people hear that and say, oh, I'm going to get rid of every plant in my yard. I'm going to get rid of any fuel. And so what you're doing is essentially kind of clear cutting your property of any plant. So a lot of people where I live, that's what they did to prepare, was get rid of everything. But what you're doing now is creating a rectangle, some sort of polygon, whatever shape your property is, that is has nothing in it except for your structure. And if winds are blowing through, there is nothing in their way to stop embers besides your structure. So this is called the bowling alley effect. So I want to, again, show you a little micro case study within my case study. So this is one of my neighbors here. They heard that advice and were like, okay, I am going to make my property safe. I'm going to get rid of every plant that I have on my property. So essentially their property kind of goes here and it goes down into the canyon. So they got rid of everything. And then the fire came through. And so you can imagine the winds are coming up the bowl. And the only thing, or the first thing that those embers are hitting is the structure. There's nothing else in the way except for that house. So that house unfortunately didn't make it. And the main reason I really wanted to highlight this is because for the most part, before the campfire, I didn't think I saw anything wrong with that, except for ecologically, I was devastated that they got rid of all of those plants. But when it comes to fire safety, I understood. But then when I started researching it more and understand what winds do and how they move embers and how plants can be our friends in slowing down the embers or even stopping the embers, because if you remember, our houses are made of dead wood. There's no water in them. All of these plants that are alive are filled with water. They're like water bags. So they can withstand fire for a long time, especially these big mature trees versus something obviously that's like a dead grass. But our houses are way more flammable than these healthy trees here. So coming back now, coming out of the micro case study here, even before the fire, we knew we wanted to keep our trees. We wanted to prioritize our trees because at the top of a ridgeline, if you've ever been at the top of a ridgeline or have gone hiking and have got to the top of, a mountain, it's windy. It is so, so windy. And so we inadvertently were like, we want to slow those winds so it's not so intense on the house. And so we wanted to keep these trees to basically create lots of turbulence so the winds aren't as bad on the house. And in doing so, we wanted to decrease the density of the trees, get rid of ones that were diseased or sick. We prioritized our oaks. We had a few incense cedars that were really close to the house. And despite the fact that I love an incense cedar, they're not a good plant to have right adjacent to the house. They can be sappy sometimes. And nonetheless, not a really great plant, as well as we had lots of ponderosa pines as well. So we prioritized our oaks. They're very dense wood, very hard to ignite. And then we kind of got rid of any ladder fuels underneath and essentially created what now is being called a shaded fuel break. And so you can see it kind of looks like whenever you go into like a park like Yosemite and everything is kind of cleaned up on the bottom. They have maintained these beautiful, gorgeous trees, make sure they're healthy, they're limbed up, all of that. And that's essentially what we prioritized. And it apparently was a great thing for us to do. We luckily did not lose our house. It could have just been luck more so than anything. You saw those embers from our trail cam. I feel like it was luck, but nonetheless, this is kind of what we focused on, were our beautiful trees. So in highlighting and again, continuing my discussion of wind, especially where I live, is essential. But again, looking at the statistics of the fires that are the most intense, cause the most destruction, it's wind. Wind is the biggest variable that causes these very destructive fires. So what I challenge everyone to do, and what we challenge everyone to do in our book, is to think about wind and really how it provides context for the greater context and kind of like a smaller scale context. So I use apps and websites that kind of give me an idea of the general trade winds around where I live. So broad scale context of wind. And then I use small scale little helpers that can tell me a little bit more about the micro patterns of wind around my house. So I can kind of know where debris is going to build up. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a second. And this is really important because, wind is like weather, and weather, unlike climate, is something that changes at the drop of a hat. You don't know when it's going to be consistent, when it's not going to be consistent. Sometimes we can see general patterns, again, like in climate, but weather is never going to stay the same. And wind is a perfect example of that. So you need to make observations at different sides of your structure, because all structures kind of have different patterns on different faces of the structure. And this is important to kind of note based on debris. And again, I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second, kind of showing some pictures from my house. And then also noting that those patterns change throughout the day and throughout the season. So this is something that's kind of time that you invest to kind of understanding a little bit more about the wind, so you can make really good decisions about your landscape plants and how you can, how they can actually help you hopefully stay as safe as you can be during a fire. Okay, so these are a few different websites that kind of show trade winds. And again, I'm gonna have to move my boxes here for a second. And so one of my favorite ones in terms of just preparation, because I have two different sites here that are good for preparation. My favorite one is Windfinder. It's just a little bit more simple. It essentially just kind of shows you the direction of where the wind is. So right now I have this right over my house. Wait, why isn't, oh dang, it's not letting me move my boxes again. And then at the bottom, dang it, hold on. Almost there. Okay. At the bottom, oh no, hold on. I lost it. I lost it. It's because I'm trying to hit so many boxes at the same time. Okay, hold on. Let me go back. Okay. Oh, wait. Okay, there we go. So at the bottom, you can actually see if you like accelerate. So I said add 3 hours, like what is it going to be doing in a little bit? You can see it totally changed directions. So you can see how the wind is changing. Like you can kind of look over many different time periods. Like, again, it's an estimation. It's not perfect, but it does give you a little bit of context of how the wind is going to change throughout the day. So I really like this. And there's different little buttons and things you can push. Windy is very, very similar. It has more variables here. So you can pick temperature, thunder, whatever you want to look for. There's a lot of different variables here on the side besides wind. But the wind, it gives you a little, color scale for kind of what the velocity is. But if you get too close, that kind of goes away and you don't really know exactly what's going on anymore. And that's kind of why I like this one a little bit more. It's a little bit easier to zoom in and still have that context. You can see I was zoomed in a little bit too far, but it lets me zoom in a little bit more. So the other one that I really like, if there is a fire, is Watch Duty. So this is what Adrienne and I have been using over the last, I don't know how long it's been. It seems like it's been going on forever. But over the last couple weeks, Watch Duty basically shows you where the fire boundaries are, and then you can turn on the layer to show you where the wind is. And so it can show you, so for example, I am right over here and I am not that far from the fire, but if the wind changed to moving this direction, I would be leaving and evacuating. But I've been very lucky. You can see what direction the wind is. The fire started right here. The wind has pretty much been pushing it out this direction the entire time. So I've been really lucky. And so this is a good way for me. If there is a fire near me, I can be like, okay, am I going to have to be worried about this fire, or am I not going to have to be worried about this fire? And so far, I've been very lucky compared to others that the fire has not been blowing in my direction. So nonetheless, these are some great different options for broad scale patterning. At my house, for kind of small scale patterns and trying to understand that, I use a little weather station. This is very old. I think I got it at Costco for $100 at some time, like right before the campfire. And so somehow it survived. You can see it's not in great condition, but it still works. I use Windfish, and those are really great. Again, just kind of telling me a little bit about the patterns around the house. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about my patterns. So like if I would encourage you to do this, like go outside and be like, are there things or like debris building up anywhere? So at my house, north and south faces of the house are windblown. So there are some sticks and maybe some leaves on the ground, but the wind is pretty strong. And so it blows it across and it doesn't gather around the house. But on the west and east sides of the house, I get tons of debris buildup. And so you can see this is in fall. But that is kind of telling me where I get a lot of debris buildup and where likely I'm going to have ember buildup if there's a fire. So I have a ton on the west side of the house where I get a lot more wind eddies. And I still get a good amount on the east as well. But it kind of shoves itself in the cracks and little things. And so that all needs to be cleaned out before fire season. So what all of this tells you is where your wind is pushing your debris and where it's likely to push your embers. So this is a really important thing to, again, note about the wind and about likelihoods of potential weak points of your structure during a fire event. And then overall, I just have a couple summary slides, and then I think we'll be ready for questions here. So for my current firescaping focus points, I'm focusing on clearing debris. I use lots of burn piles, and then I cycle in all of the stuff we use from our burn piles back into the soil. We do a lot of chipping of limbs that we've like collected or limbed up, or things that we find that have broken off of trees. And then we compost those chips to spread out in the yard. We control regrowth or resprouts of plants that are getting to be high in density. So again, kind of thinning where appropriate. And then we get rid of invasives, because invasives are really bad for fire safety. For the habitat gardening, which I didn't talk too much about, but we really focus on planting California natives, especially that are native to the habitat or the greater habitat that I live within. We encourage the grow back of natives since the fire, as long as they're in a great spot and I can safely feel like they can fit into my landscaping. I focus some on like abiotic components of habitat as well, like rock or tree cookies for animals. So here I have a little like rock house here that I made, and the lizards absolutely love it. They cannot get enough of this thing. And then I also have a little water trough for animals, and I have tons of rocks in there, so any sized critter can get in or out of it. And then the last thing I just want to note, for those of you who kind of live in areas where you have a non-fire season protocol versus fire season protocol, it is totally okay during the non-fire season, like us in winter, it gets cold, we have a wood stove, that you put your wood outside when it's not fire season. So in winter, we put wood by the house. Then when it gets close, into fire season, so like in middle spring, we'll clear out our gutters, we'll get rid of our wood. And then during fire season, we just kind of keep watching all of this. We've probably cleared out our gutters 3 times since the initial clearing of the gutters in spring. So, it's okay to make little changes when it's the off season. I just want to emphasize that because I know people can get a little stressed. Okay, so I think that hits on everything. Oh. All right, so I think we can do questions.
So we have a few questions. Thank you very much. That was a really interesting presentation, not really where I was thinking you were coming from. So you have a very beautiful house, way far away from suburbia where I live.
Well, and actually I live in suburbia, and yet the park fire started about 4 miles from where I live. So it's just that, I'm sitting down in Chico, right on the edge of the foothills. So my yard is crammed full of plants, and my yard is also not as fire safe, but structurally the houses are not either.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So
and I lived through the Thomas fire here in Ventura, which up until the campfire, I think, was the biggest and most destructive fire.
Yeah.
And it was the same thing with the wind. That first night, it rolled all the way from Santa Paula to Ventura, which is about 20 miles
Yeah.
in, an hour. And there was just no stopping it. So all the discussion that you had, Rachel, of planning for wind was certainly completely applicable even in this suburban area, even though we're
Yes.
not out in the wild.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the point, like even though I'm kind of in a weird, not very common sort of situation, that doesn't mean that it doesn't apply to other situations and other types of habitats as well. So it's something that's really important to think about no matter where you live.
Right. So a couple of questions came in on the chat. Eric asked if you'd like the author or name of the slope planting paper.
Yeah,
This is
but
all,
I,
and you did post that. Yeah,
Mhm.
I'm not going to repeat it because there's like 20
Yeah.
names. But if anybody is not aware, if you click on the button at the bottom, you can see the chat to everyone. And Adrienne has posted the paper if you want to do some more of your own looking into that paper on the slope planting. It was like the first or second slide that you showed. We also have a picture of, can you further explain how the tall mature trees can protect a house? Rachel, I think you kind of went over that a little bit about ember catching. And I suppose there's more details in your book or online about exactly how high you limb trees, how far from your house.
Yes.
There's stuff on CAL FIRE. Do you want to speak to any other resources that people could look up besides getting your wonderful book?
Actually, Rachel, could you put the slide back up or the slides back up and show the shelter belt image?
So that was from, oh yeah, and that was from CAL FIRE.
No, these images are ones that we were actually came from the Midwest. And there's a lot of research on shelter belts that are used for wind breaks and snow breaks. But those, the research based on that, on wind movement around these windbreaks also apply to what we're calling fire shelter belts. And the key is that you don't want the windbreaks to be, or the fire breaks to be too dense, because then the wind would just eddy around the backside. But if you reduce the vegetation by between 30 to 60%, depending on where you live, that slows the wind, it reduces turbulence, and it can actually capture a lot of embers. And so that's sort of the thinking behind maintaining some of that vegetation.
Hey, Adrienne, I think when you put the post in for the slope planning paper, you just sent it to the host and panelists.
Oh, sorry. I'll fix it.
Happens all the time. If you can just resend that to
Sorry.
so everyone can see it.
Yep.
Okay. That should answer a couple of questions.
And we also, I mean, in our book, we actually focus on giving examples of native plants that are good, have good fire resistance, can be maintained in healthy ways, that are excellent substitutions for commonly used not so good plants. So, for example, everybody knows what an oleander is, and many people try and advertise oleander as being a fire resistant plant. Well, oleander, as you probably also know, in my mind, the only appropriate use of oleander is in the highway medians, because nothing uses it, right? It's got poisonous nectar. The entire plant is poisonous. And yes, it's fire resistant if it's all very green and lush with no dead wood. But if you neglect a patch of oleander, it becomes decadent with a lot of dead wood and debris, and can become very hazardous in terms of very ignitable. So
Yeah, Adrienne and I actually found a source that recommended you like planting it and then keeping it until it was mature and then ripping it out, because then it's not fire safe anymore. And we were like, why would you do that to begin with?
Yeah.
Like, and plus it's toxic. So it's like, you don't want to touch it like that much. So I don't, it just seems like a lot of work to keep an oleander. So I don't know.
Well, and
Yeah.
I've seen you know, plant lists from fire departments, which often do not include any or very few California native plants,
Ugh.
because I think everything will explode if you
And
hold.
often they're invasive, noxious invaders like privet.
So do you know if there's any movement in the fire department community towards embracing plants, or is it still just kind of
It's
we're
the wild,
talking
wild
about two
west right
different
now.
It is the Wild West, but I have to say some fire safe council organizations, depending on who the composition, are actually doing really good work in that regard. And for example, in the campfire footprint, the Butte Fire Safe Council partnered with ecologists and experts who could make recommendations for native trees to replant, and they even encouraged shifting the habitat zones uphill a little bit, and reducing the pine composition a bit, which was a result of logging and fire suppression, to accommodate climate change and fire safety and native plants. So, you know, as knowledgeable gardeners, getting involved with fire safe councils, I think, is what we really need to do to start re-educating people.
Yeah, and you guys, we get a lot of information on using succulents, because succulents are supposedly non-flammable. You can't probably grow that many up where you guys are because it's
Oh, we
too
do.
cold.
No,
Oh,
actually, I can in Chico, and succulents are great until they become decadent. It's just like oleander. If you don't maintain them, there's there's great example. One of the great examples in the Coast Range, I guess, is ice plant. People think it's fire resistant, but if you have it on a slope for a lot of years, there's a lot of dead material in there.
somebody wrote in and said, if you have a deodar, Kay wrote in and said, if you have a deodar cedar within 5 feet of your house, is this a no-brainer removal regardless of the large tree's benefits?
Oh, no, just limit up. They're beautiful.
A lot of big deodars down in
And
that.
keep it pretty clean, right? So during fire season, keep it pretty clean, limit up, I don't know. I mean, it depends on the wind, it depends on the fuels, the other fuels around it.
Yeah,
Same
it's really hard because there's a lot of plants that get a bad rap. Like, for example, where we are and probably where you are, manzanita, like every fire person I've ever talked to is like, manzanita is the worst. It
Really?
should never be anywhere. But it's like, it's one of those things where it's like, it's an amazing native. It takes a long time for that thing to ignite. If you have it in certain situations, you can keep it. You just have to give it lots of space.
Yeah.
So there's many ways that you can keep plants even that people say are not great or can be very dangerous. You just really kind of have to weigh the pros and cons of whether you want it and you want to maintain it and you want to put that love into maintaining it and keeping it safe, or whether it's going to be too much work for you or too much of a fight. So, you really got to think about what things you want to prioritize and then work really diligently to, maintain that decision.
Yeah. We have another question. This is on mulch. Alfred asked, does composted mulch last as long as regular mulch?
I think it does. Because usually I will, because I'm a cheapskate, and if I get mulch, I don't buy it. I actually get it. I tug on the sleeve of some tree guy and say, can I have that pile? And then I compost it for a while, which you'd want to do anyway, because it depletes a lot of nitrogen when it's first churning. But yeah, it holds up pretty well.
I exclusively use it. I mean, because I make it from everything in my yard. So I'm very particular as an ecology person, just wanting to keep every ounce of nutrition that I'm taking out and recycle it back in as much as I can. And even though, essentially with composting, like what really gets in there is lots of fungus and bacteria into there. And of course, like it probably has a slightly smaller life than, a regular wood chip, but I've had some places where I've compost mulched and it's been years and years and years and it's still going strong. So, it's one of those things where like once it gets to a point where it starts really looking funky and you're not seeing it anymore, it's probably the time that you would refresh regular mulch anyway. So I don't really see a big significant difference in how long they last.
By composted mulch, you mean something that has been allowed to go through a season, start getting rid of some of that nitrogen, and is the quality of the wood changes so that it is no longer fresh and full of all those oils and chemicals. Okay.
Yeah, it tends to have mycelia in it.
Once it starts really decomposing, then it's
yeah, once I see all the dog vomit slime all over my compost pile, I'm like, okay, I'm ready to stir it up and put it in the yard.
Love those slime molds.
We have a question from Kathy. Says she's doing the various elements in your book, but it's overwhelming. She has an old house in WI, low hills filled with dead shrubs, wood fences, house on top of a ridge, etc. What are the most important things to do first? And she loves your book.
Rachel.
I would say work from zone 1 out. So like the biggest thing that's going to keep your house as safe as it can be in a fire is that first non-combustible zone. We actually, the first time we visited our house after the fire, we saw that a fire crew had come by and on a couple points of the yard, they had scraped back just 3 feet to make sure there was just soil in the first 3 feet from our structure. And I mean, I don't know if that's what did it, if luck did it, I don't know, whatever sort of magic happened to not ignite our house during the campfire. But even just, focusing on that first zone and getting rid of everything, in terms of the research, that makes a really, really big difference. And then from there, it's just getting rid of debris, being like, oh, I want to maintain and get rid of all those leaves and stuff that's filling in all the cracks around the house. And then, just working slowly out. That's what I would suggest. That's essentially what I did. And it takes years. It's not something you can do in a month. It's something that takes a long time to feel good about. I mean, we essentially lived in our house for a few years before the campfire, and that's essentially what we did. We just kind of made these little slow concentric circles, just slowly working ourselves out from the house.
And it might be reassuring too to know that the research is pretty much saying the first 30 feet are the most important. That 0 to 5 or the non-combustible zone, 0 to 15 if it's high fire, and then 30 feet out, 9, triple that if you're in a really risky place, like maybe on the ridge side. But beyond that, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, I definitely was overwhelmed by it as well. And I feel overwhelmed by it all the time because I'll go out like way outside 100 feet from the house and it's just absolute chaos out there. Because I want it to be habitat basically, because our property is adjacent to national forest and like, just lumberland and, just lots of wildlands. And so, I see that and I'm like, oh my gosh, but it's like, just got to maintain that first 30 feet, got to focus on that. And then little bits at a time, you can venture out into other zones and do thinning and clearing. But yeah, like Adrienne said, the first 2 zones are the big ones.
Right. What do you think about using oak tree leaf litter as mulch? Just letting the leaves lie.
Actually and this, whoever's asking that probably knows that if you have native oak trees and you're raking away all of the leaves out from under it, that's not good for the trees. They do need those decomposing leaves there, but during fire season, you want to break up the fuels. So you might want to have bare areas and leaf areas. And of course, you wouldn't want to grow a vegetable garden where you're putting oak leaves, but oak leaves are wonderful.
Yeah, I leave my leaves, outside of my 30 feet. They're there to do whatever and they don't last long either, because a lot of people are like, oh, they're gonna take forever to no, they're gone. Like they don't last very long. They just get right back into the soil pretty quick.
I think our live oak leaves last a little bit longer.
Yeah.
Because they're more tougher.
Those are the ones I see, because I have some live oaks and I have black oaks. So the live oaks are definitely, their little skeletons are usually what's left.
Yeah. Something will take care of it.
Mhm.
And then Carol points out that the Las Politas Nursery website, if anybody hasn't been to Las Politas Nursery website, it is an old school website with tons of information on native plants, California native plants. They've been around forever. But they also apparently have a list of ignition times for native plants.
They do, but you've got to take that with a grain of salt, of course. It depends on the hydration level of the leaves and the conditions. I love that little experiment they did where they held a leaf and they timed how long they held a match to it or a lighter. But it's a very, it can be dangerous to take too much, to put too much into that.
It was
anybody who's I'm sorry, what?
I was gonna say it was a small data.
Yeah, and
Small data break.
Those are very specific conditions that he was doing it under. We also, I mean, as gardeners, that when you look out your window or walk out into your yard, you can tell if your plants are thirsty just by looking at them. You don't even have to feel the soil. If even your natives are starting to look a little peaked, then, if it's not too hot and you can water at night once a month or twice a month, you can see that in just the orientation of the leaves.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting that you guys brought up that the Japanese charred fencing.
Yeah.
Because our neighbor did it across the street here.
Cool.
He put up just a blank wooden fence, and then he was standing out there with basically a blowtorch.
Yeah.
For a couple days. I don't know if that's the proper way to do it, but it looks really nice.
Oh. Seems like it'd be really hot here in Chico in the summertime to have a charred wood fence, and a lot of work, but
I think it also keeps people from graffitiing it a little bit. So.
Right.
I don't think we have too many more questions. Follow up for the oak tree leaf litter, as somebody says Magda says she uses oak tree leaf litter in other areas when the layer is higher than 4 inches.
Oh yeah.
So that's helpful. I think we've answered everybody's questions. Let me just check and see if there's one more. Nope. So I think we can go on to, we would love to give away a copy of your book, which is very interesting, and is available through Hachette or Timber Press. That's your publisher, or if you must, through Amazon. So,
or there's other independent booksellers that you can get it
exactly
for pretty comparable now.
Yep. Oh, and Sandy mentions that they have an example of the charred wood technique at the Huntington down here. There's a video of it on the Huntington website and how they made it, so that's probably fairly accurate. I just want to thank both Rachel and Adrienne again for putting together a very useful and very interesting book for all of us, and for your presentation tonight. And we wish you both the best and stay safe.
Thank you so much for having us. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a great evening.
Okay, bye-bye.